Greetings. This video serves as an introduction to verbal communication. When we communicate, we use two systems of signals. Okay, two main systems of signals. The first is verbal and the second is nonverbal. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the verbal system of communication. When we're talking about verbal communication, we're not just talking about orality. Okay, we're talking about words. So this can be spoken or this could be written words. We also consider sign language to be verbal communication. Okay? So when we're talking about verbal communication, we oftentimes talk about 8 different principles of verbal messages. And by knowing about these 8 principles of verbal messages, it will help us to understand and study verbal communication and verbal messages much better. So first, message meanings are in people. Okay, this simply means that meaning is determined by words and by people. What does love, beautiful, or freedom mean to you? More than likely, the way that you define and understand those 3 words is going to be different than the people around you. I mean, what other words can you think of where there has often been confusion in your communication with somebody else? Again, if we start thinking about all the times that we say, but that's not what I meant, a big part of this has to do with the fact that meanings are within people. We can also say that meanings are denotative or connotative. Now, the easiest way to think about denotative and connotative is to say that the denotative meaning of a word is the dictionary definition of the word. So if we were looking at the word dog, you would go into Webster's or whatever dictionary you want and see what the actual literal definition of the word dog is. Okay. Connotative meaning, this is the meaning that's within us. Okay, so you may know what the literal definition of, or the denotative definition of the word dog. However, when you were younger, perhaps you were bitten by a dog. All right, and so that when somebody talks about, oh, I'm going to bring my dog over, you start thinking of some type of snarling, vicious kind of Cujo-esque type of animal. All right. When others of us think of dogs, we think of, maybe man's best friend or a member of the family, or maybe we think of the Taco Bell Chihuahua or something nice and cuddly and something that licks your face and sleeps by your feet and that sort of thing. So that becomes kind of the connotative type of meaning for particular words. Again, if we return to words like we could talk about assertiveness. What's your definition of assertiveness? Okay, is it good? Is it bad? Does it mean it's somebody who's badgering you? We could talk about ugly. Everybody's going to have a slightly different definition of what is considered ugly and or beautiful. All right, though we can find actual definitions of those words in the dictionary. The third principle is that messages can be anonymous or anonymous. Okay, if we're talking about anonymous, this is a message that is signed or that we have identified who the speaker or the communicator is. Okay, obviously this is the opposite of what anonymous is, so we wouldn't know who is saying or writing a particular message. What I would like you to do is take a couple of minutes and think about what are the benefits and the drawbacks of both the anonymous and the anonymous types of communication. There are benefits and drawbacks to both. We could think about Rate My Professor as a type of anonymous communication. Now, I'm not saying that all of the information that's on Rate My Professor is good or bad. There's a mix of types of communication on Rate My Professor, again, this is going to have to do with the fact that it is partially anonymous. However, if it wasn't anonymous and it was anonymous, we would have other kinds of benefits and other kinds of problems based on that. Okay, so again, make sure you look this section over in your book and think about some different types of examples and how you feel about the anonymous or anonymous types of communication. Our fourth principle is message meanings vary in abstraction. We talk about Hayakawa's ladder of abstraction. So if you think about an actual like step ladder with different rungs, all right, if we go to the very top of the ladder, this is going to be highly abstract words or very highly abstract meanings. The closer to the ground you get, the more concrete the meaning becomes. So for example, we could have food at the top rung of the ladder of abstraction. The next rung down might be lunch. The next rung down might be Mexican. Okay, so you can see we're progressing to something a little more specific. Then we might go down to Chipotle. And then maybe the final rung of the ladder is chicken burrito. Okay, it's just I didn't have lunch today, so I'm hungry, and that's where that example kind of came from. But the more abstract our language is, okay, the harder it becomes for us to have a very clear understanding of one another. Okay, so there's a greater chance of miscommunication with the higher levels of abstraction. The more concrete we are, the more clear and the better chance of the listener understanding the speaker in the way that the speaker intended. If we go to principle 5, message meanings vary in politeness. All right, so politeness is going to reflect positivity. It's going to reflect respectfulness, and oftentimes polite messages are less direct. Okay, we're thinking about other people's feelings. We're thinking about being proper. Now, on the other spectrum here, we have impolite, which has to do with attacking. It's very autonomous, and the communication is far more direct. Okay. Now, sometimes when we're being very, very direct, we don't mean to be impolite, though we know that it could hurt somebody else's feelings. It could make them think more negatively about us. Now, when we're talking about politeness, we definitely have to think about culture and gender. Okay, our culture and our understanding of gender, based on our culture, is going to greatly impact our understanding of what is considered polite and impolite. So, for you, if you were to think about, what might be polite or impolite for men, and then what might be polite or impolite for women, are they the same or are there some differences? If you're saying they're the same, I want you to take a minute and I want you to think about assertiveness. We have, in American culture, we have a tendency to think of it's okay for men to be very assertive. However, we have a tendency to look down on women who are very assertive. Why might that be? The next principle has to do with immediacy. So messages vary in immediacy, and we're talking about immediacy. We're talking about our sense of closeness between the sender and the receiver. We accomplish immediacy through different means. So we can do it through self-disclosure. We can do this by referring to the other person's good qualities, talking about our commonalities, being responsive to their communication through verbal and nonverbal feedback. Now, you might be asking, well, who cares about this, right? Well, think about an employer-employee relationship. Okay, we have found that employers, managers, whoever, when they are dealing with their employees, have a much better communication climate, and are far more successful in achieving their goals if the managers use some immediacy cues. Okay, it helps to make their employees feel valued, and that their experiences and that their ideas matter. Okay, which makes them want to work harder and to work better. Another way that you might think about this is the teacher-student relationship. I'm creating these videos instead of doing a PowerPoint lecture with audio attached to it, because this should give us a greater sense of immediacy since you can see me. When you're in the classroom, one of the first things that professors do to try to create a sense of immediacy is by learning students' names. Sometimes it's easier for some professors than others. It's really hard for me to learn students' names, especially when I have 80 to 100 students a semester. It takes a while for me to learn them. But by calling on students by name rather than pointing and saying you, that creates a sense of closeness. Okay, and it's a far more it creates a far more engaging type of atmosphere. If we move to the next principle, messages can deceive. Of course, messages can deceive. This becomes kind of a fun one. There's lots of different types of deception that we engage in, right? So we can engage in pro-social deception, and pro-social deception is to achieve some good. So, for example, rather than criticizing somebody's work, you point out the good parts of their work. If your significant other asks if a particular outfit makes them look heavy, you might say, no, you look beautiful, you look sexy, you look amazing, you look handsome, all of those kind of things, even though you might not actually think so. That becomes pro-social deception. We could look at self-enhancement deception. This is when we try to make ourselves look good. Now, we do this all the time, so maybe we embellish on how well we did on a particular exam. There's lots of different ways in which we can engage in self-enhancement deception. There's also selfish deception. This is deception that we use to protect ourselves. Again, you may not be the only one who disagree. You may not want to be the only one who disagrees with a particular idea, and so perhaps you say that you do. Okay. Again, you're protecting yourself in this way because you think that other people will look down on you. The last type of deception that your book is going to talk about is antisocial deception. This is deception that we use to harm someone. We might use it to harm their reputation. We might use it to harm their credibility, to discredit their work. There's lots of different ways in which we can engage in antisocial deception. It just is going to depend on the context. Okay. Now, something for you to think about when it comes to deception is all deception bad, or is some of the deception good? How often do we engage in deception? We could talk about, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy as examples of deception, perhaps, and why do we engage in them? Okay. The next principle is message meanings vary in assertiveness. All right. When we're talking about assertiveness, we can talk about non-assertive, we can talk about aggressive, and we can talk about assertive. And you might think about your own personal communication style. Which one of these do you engage in most? When do you engage in these different types of messages? In what kind of situations, right? We have a tendency to do these things in patterns. And so understanding our own patterns becomes helpful to us. So when we're talking about non-assertive, think of a lose-win situation. So for example, and lose-win means that you lose and you let the other person win. So let's say that we have a piece of pizza and you're really, really hungry, but your roommate says that they want the piece of pizza, and you say, okay, and you know that it's going to be a big fight, and so you say, okay, fine, just take the piece of pizza. All right, so you lost, they won. There's also aggressive messages, which is a you win, they lose. And so perhaps you say, in regards to the pizza to your roommate, either I'm going to eat this piece of pizza or I'm going to throw it away. Okay, that becomes a very aggressive type of communicative message. The last one is assertive. You might think of assertive as compromise. I wouldn't necessarily call it a compromise, although a lot of times it is. We talk about this as kind of a win-win situation, but this is going to be you as the communicator asserting yourself and letting your communicative partner know what it is that you want. All right, and so if we were talking about the piece of pizza again, you might say, well, I'm hungry, you're hungry, so let's split it. That's the only example I can think of right now, and it is a compromising example. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be a compromising example. All right. So that became, I think that ended up being all 8 principles. There's a couple more things that I did want to talk about before I end this video. The first is confirming and disconfirming messages, and I think it's because, and this is important, right? So disconfirming messages is when we ignore the other person's communication and their presence. All right, this is a very negative kind of communication, right? We're basically kind of saying, well, you're not worth anything to me. The opposite of that becomes confirming messages, and this is when we acknowledge the other person's communication and we validate or accept that other person in terms of their sense of self-definition and the definition of the relationship that we have with them. Okay, so this becomes a very kind of positive, affirming type of communication. The third type third type of message that we can talk about here would be a rejection message. Now, a rejection message is not the same as disconfirming. A rejection message acknowledges the other person, but you disagree with them. Okay, you indicate your unwillingness to accept something that the other person says or does. Okay, so again, disconfirming messages are very, very negative. And I want you to think about a couple of things here when it comes to confirming, disconfirming, and rejection. All right. So towards the end of the chapter in your textbook, the authors write about sexism, racism, heterosexism, and ageism. I want you to think about this. Do you consider these items, or these isms, to be confirming, disconfirming, or rejection? Okay. I'm going to say that most of you are either going to say that they are disconfirming or rejection. And the reason that you categorize them in either way is going to be very telling about how you feel about those different types of isms. So, I'm kind of asking you to take a self-inventory and just kind of reflect on this a little bit. All right. Finally, always remember that we can and we should want to improve our verbal communication. The end of this chapter, the very end of this chapter, the authors are going to give you some hints on how to improve your verbal communication. I implore you to make sure that you look this over and start thinking about the ways in which you can improve your verbal communication. When you get into the workplace, being an effective communicator becomes really, really important. As you start to create close, intimate relationships with others and potentially create families together, having a good, sound, communicative environment into being very verbally adept is going to help you succeed in happiness and is going to help prevent negative conflict. Okay? So that's all I have for you today, and I will see you next time.